Well, good afternoon, everybody. Both those of you here present at Green College at the University of British Columbia and colleagues around the world, which I think means in this case principally at McGill University in Montreal, and Sarah just across town in Vancouver. This is the first ever, let's call it Green Genes lecture seminar in the history of the world, using the Blue Genes platform, which is this other piece of that enables us, if everything goes well, to have a lecture and then a discussion involving colleagues in other jurisdictions. I've seen this happen a couple of other times hosted from McGill. This is the first time that we've tried to do it from here, so please bear with us if there are technical glitches. There have been a number already which have been solved. The routine will be much as ever, except there will come a moment in about an hour's time when we'll try to field questions and comments from the remote audience. This is the latest, which is to say the 6th lecture in a series on the theme of conversion and religious transformation, ancient and modern experiences and paradigms, which is occurring at the intersection of two major international, interdisciplinary, collaborative research projects. One of them on the theme of early modern conversions, headquartered at McGill University. The other on the evolution of religion and morality, headquartered at UBC. And it's my pleasure now to turn this podium and all its accessories over to the director, principal investigator of the Evolution of Religion and Morality project, Slingerland, who will introduce today's speaker. Thank you, Tom.
I don't want to touch it. I hope you're all right up here. So welcome everyone to the latest talk in our series. I'm Edward Slingerland of Preservation Studies here at UBC. Our speaker tonight is Alexander Beecroft. He's a very unusual beast in academia. He really does genuine cross-cultural, interdisciplinary work. So he's associate professor in classics and comparative literature in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at the University of South Carolina, and works on Greek and Latin language and literature, ancient civilizations, literary theory, ancient and modern, and theory and practice of world literature. But what I find so interesting is his background, really deep background in both classics of Western classics, Greek and Roman world, but also the Chinese classics of pre-Tang literature. And there's quite a bit about the pre-Qin tradition that I work on. His first book is Authorship and Cultural Identity in Early Greece and China, Patterns of Literary Circulation. So this came out from Cambridge in 2010. He has a recent book just out last month called An Ecology of World Literature from Antiquity to the Present Day. This came out in January, and is currently working on a very modest project called The Global History of Literature. It's going to explain all of literature throughout all of time across the entire globe, which is under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press. And his talk to us tonight will be on the topic of the roads to Damascus and Hanoi, conversion and cosmopolitanism in the New Testament, and the Mouzi Lihuolun. And presumably he'll explain that. Let's welcome Alex.
Okay, well, thank you to Ted for that very kind introduction and also for the invitation here to speak. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm actually originally from Edmonton, although I've spent the last 15 years of my life living in the United States, so it's a pleasure to be back home, more or less, and in much better weather than I would be having in Edmonton, I'm sure, at this time of year. So I want to start also, I guess, with a brief disclaimer, as it were, sort of statement of my relationship to this talk, which is I'm obviously not a scholar of religion, I'm a scholar of literature. I'm approaching these texts in that spirit very much. Also, I suppose you could say that for me, both the New Testament and the Mouzi理惑論, which is a little bit later, qualify as early modern. For me, I mostly work on earlier materials than these. It's that sort of interest that brings me to these texts today, and that sort of approach that I'm going to take. So one of the ways in which I'm interested in these particular texts are what they have to say about literary or cultural cosmopolitanism. And for that idea, I'm indebted initially to the work of Sheldon Pollock, who I'm sure a number of you I've come across or read bits of along the way. And his idea, particularly of the Sanskrit literary cosmopolis, which he would describe as a vast translingual, transpolitical space within which a single literary language dominates, in the case of Sanskrit, obviously Sanskrit. For him, and in his work, he talks about how from Afghanistan to Java, over this vast stretch of space and considerable stretch of time, from roughly 100 to 1100 AD, a large number of local rulers represent themselves and represent their power using the medium of Sanskrit, not because they've been conquered by Sanskrit speakers, not because they've been converted to a Sanskrit-speaking religion exactly, not because of trade or colonization or any of these other factors that we think of in modern times as being the reasons for language choice, but rather, perhaps we could say, the charismatic power of the language, that Sanskrit itself exerted this charismatic influence. And I think these things are always more complicated than that might seem. I actually talk about this idea myself in my new book, which I am shamelessly plugging for you here now. So I very kindly mentioned the title, but I thought I would show you a picture just to reinforce that it is now available for sale. And in this book, I think about a variety of different literary ecologies, as I call them, contexts within which literatures interact with their political and cultural environments, including other languages, right? And so therefore the question of why do I write in a particular language, why do I participate in a particular literary conversation, that choice is influenced in every case by a variety of factors, right? Political, economic, cultural, and so on. And I sketch out a kind of a series of 6 linguistic ecologies for this purpose, one of which, the third out of the 6 in chronological sequence, I guess, is the cosmopolitan, drawing on Pollock's idea. So the literary cosmopolis as a time, a place of the widespread use of a particular literary language by peoples who are not native speakers of that language, who are not necessarily under the political rule of an empire or polity speaking that language, although they may be. Right? And it's actually, I think if you look at the kinds of examples that I list up there, the Sumerian Akkadian world, Greek, Latin, Persian, Arabic, classical Chinese, or Sanskrit, in many of those cases, these cosmopolises really begin with conquest, right? And begin with some kind of political motivation for the choice of language. But in each case, that choice long outlasts any political entity that it originally legitimated it, right? And so, and in fact, often exceeds the borders. So in the Middle Ages, Ireland is a place where people write in Latin, even though they were never part of the Roman Empire and certainly aren't part of a Latin-speaking polity at the time. Similarly, Japan is a place where people write in classical Chinese, even though it's not because they've been conquered by a Chinese empire. Right, so literary cosmopolises in this sense are environments within which a particular literary language is used over a long period of time. In each of these cases, I think you can say for over 1,000 years, that the same literary language gets used across a large region. It's not unified politically during that time. And I think there's some kind of typological comparison that's meaningful and valuable to make on that basis, right, between all of these systems. And part of the value of the comparison lies in the differences, right? In the kinds of differences that maybe come to light, especially by thinking through the similarities as well. And thinking about questions of, for example, how monocentric or polycentric is a cultural system. The Greek literary cosmopolis is a highly polycentric system. It never really has a single cultural center until maybe Constantinople. Right? Other literary cosmopolises are much more monocentric and much more concentrated on an imperial capital. Or there are still others where there may be multiple political capitals, but there's nonetheless a certain region from which texts tend to be exported and into which texts are rarely imported. And this is something that's been relatively little study on in many of the cases of literary cosmopolis, is how much, for example, texts written in literary Chinese in Japan or Korea or Vietnam, to what extent they were read in China. And we know of individual cases where this happens, but we don't really have as much systematic study of a problem like that as I think we should. And I think hopefully thinking about these questions helps to get us to that kind of inquiry. In particular, I would also say that one of the things that tends to be found in these literary cosmopolises are a kind of self-theorizing, like a self-reflexivity on the idea of universal rule. Right? That's a question that's often reflected on in some kind of way. the early Chinese tradition begins to think of such questions before there's an actual political structure that aims to implement it. I think you can see similar things in Greek philosophy as well. So I think there's a tendency for these kinds of cultures that do succeed in expanding in this very global way, that create literary worlds that are vast. There seems to be something often within the textual tradition of those literatures that is already speaking to or thinking of what a larger environment might look like. So it's in this context that I'd argue that religious conversion is, among other things, a cosmopolitan process. And that's kind of where I come into this conversation, I hope, that religious conversion is some kind of move from one universalizing cultural system to another, with the emphasis on to another, I think, that the usually larger religious system within which, or to which people are converting is generally thinking on a particularly universal scale, in some kind of way thinking through how it can be a religion that speaks to a potentially universal audience. People are, of course, not always coming from a system that thinks in that way, but they're generally moving to such a system through conversion. And so moments of religious conversion or moments of encounter with proselytizing religions are key moments where pre-existing cosmopolitan cultures are forced to confront the limits of their universalism. They're forced to think through what those limits mean, right? So in the case of early Christianity, the Greco-Roman world, which has its own very long, rich cultural tradition at this point, is confronting for the first time a religious movement, a significant religious movement that is trying to think a different kind of cosmopolitanism, perhaps. Buddhism presents a particular challenge for China in that it's something that is really exogenous to China, right? It really does begin in India in complete isolation from China and is imported from the outside. And it becomes in a way an interesting challenge, therefore, to what had otherwise been a fairly closed world in terms of literary culture, not in terms of material culture, but certainly in terms of literary culture. Right? And so in my talk today, I'm going to talk about two particular texts that narrate and or dramatize, I think, this interaction between cosmopolitan systems. On the one hand, the Greco-Roman and Christian, on the other hand, the Chinese and Buddhist. And these are the book of Acts from the New Testament, which I'll come to in a minute, and then this Buddhist apologetic text, Master Mou's Treatise on Removing Doubts, as it's been translated into English. I'll talk about the individuals involved in the text first, and then kind of move into a bit of a reading of both. Right? So Saul/Paul, and it's worth remembering in this context. I think unreflectively we tend to think that Paul changes his name to Paul from Saul because he's converted, but it's actually has nothing to do with his conversion, right? They're actually names that he uses simultaneously. He just sort of self-identifies as Paul, or is identified as Paul, which is a Latin name later in the text. So it's not a move from a Jewish name to a Christian name, it's a move from a Hebrew name to a Latin name that he's making, which is part of speaking to a different audience. His dates, if we wanted to give him dates like 5 AD to 67 AD, something like that would make some sense. He's a very cosmopolitan figure from the beginning in any sense of the word. A Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, but born in Tarsus in Asia Minor, a Greek city. He clearly knows Greek. He's raised in Jerusalem, we're told, within Acts. He probably would have known some Hebrew, but it would also have been more comfortable in Aramaic, which was obviously the language of the region at the time, and itself a kind of cosmopolitan language of administration. He was also a Roman citizen, right? And he mentions this at several points. It's kind of a crucial argument when he's on trial, right? where citizenship status obviously makes a big difference. So the ways in which Paul is identified within Acts from the beginning are very cosmopolitan. Right? He belongs to one local religious tradition, Judaism. He's a Roman citizen. He's a Greek speaker. He's an Aramaic speaker. He knows some Hebrew. Right? And within that context, we have this very complex collection of documents, right, in the New Testament. And I'm certainly not an expert in the history of the New Testament. I'm sure other people in this room know far more about it than I do. But, certainly what people talk about in the scholarship on the New Testament is the complex relationship between the epistles of Paul and Acts and the text and the narratives that are recounted in both. There are clear ways in which the story that we are given of Paul's life in Acts doesn't quite add up to the story we get in the epistles in various ways. And so there's some kind of complex construction of an important figure that's happening here. And we'll look at why that might be the case in just a minute. But I wanted to also, from the beginning, talk a little bit about Mouzi, this early Chinese figure I'm discussing. So we're told by the preface to his own text that Mou was that is a Confucian scholar official who fled from the center of China. He doesn't actually say where in particular he comes from. During the Yellow Turban Rebellion near the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty, around 184, that he ends up in roughly what's now northern Vietnam, roughly in Hanoi, in fact, which at the time is Chinese territory, although Chinese territory that's on the verge of slipping from the grasp of an increasingly collapsing imperial order in China. It was at that time the major port for Chinese trade with points further west. And there have been some who've argued that it might, in fact, be the point of entry for Buddhism into China. Right? More traditionally, we think of the transit of Buddhism into China over the Silk Road, but it's also possible it may have entered through these coastal cities in the south. Right? And so, certainly it seems to have been an interesting cosmopolitan place in its own right. Master Mou, as would have been true of any other Chinese intellectual of his time, if he existed, and I'll come back to that, he would have been a native speaker of some kind of Semitic language, some dialect of Chinese, we could say. He obviously is well-versed in literary Chinese, which is a very distinct literary form. And the city in which he's living, Jiaozhou, or what we would now call Hanoi, may well have been already the site of people speaking the ancestor of modern Vietnamese. Or may not have been, I'm not entirely certain. There were probably other languages being spoken there too. It was a region of great linguistic and cultural diversity then, certainly. And so this may be the earliest Buddhist apologetic text in Chinese, or certainly one of the earliest, if its dates are authentic, if it really does date from this period. And there are certainly good reasons to doubt that. Among others, the text isn't ever mentioned until about 550 AD. It's always one of those reasons to have slight hesitations about whether the text is as early as it claims to be from the 2nd century. I'm going to treat it here, for the purposes of this talk, I'm less interested in the actual historicity of the text itself and more in the way in which it represents the sort of relationship between Chinese culture and Buddhist culture, in the same kind of way that I'm less interested in whether Paul actually really engaged in exactly the journeys that he's described as engaging in Acts, and I'm more interested in how Acts as a document reflects the relationships between the Greco-Roman and the Jewish and Christian traditions. And what's really interesting about the Mouzi in particular is a text that actually makes not a single reference to a specific Buddhist treatise of any kind. Obviously, there's a vast corpus of Buddhist texts, none of which really have been translated into Chinese at this point. And he makes in defending Buddhism to a Chinese audience, he never once says, as it says in this Buddhist text. Instead, he kind of uses traditional Confucian and Taoist texts in China as his justification for Buddhism. It's a very strange phenomenon that way, to defend one religion by using text from quite outside it. And it's unusual in that respect, too. And in the Chinese case, as in many cases, we often see in proselytizing text one of the early sets of examples of vernacular language. Mouzi's language is the opposite of vernacular. Very highly literate text that requires that you know classical Chinese extremely well in order to make sense of it. So to get back to Saul/Paul, I guess I'm going to do what he does and start referring to him exclusively as Paul from now on. But I'd say the essential drama that we see in Acts is the relationship between Christianity and Judaism and what that relationship is going to look like. Acts, as a text certainly represents, that relationship is one that hasn't yet been worked out. Right? And early in Acts, we tend to see discussions which seem to assume that Christianity is sort of a form of Judaism or a sect within Judaism, that followers of Jesus are people who are Jews for the most part, who will mostly be following Jewish law. There are obviously lots of discussions throughout Acts about how that should play out, whether it's necessary for followers of Jesus to continue to follow Jewish law or not. And gradually, by the end of Acts, we see very definitely the notion of a Christianity led by people like Paul that is seeing itself increasingly as distinct from Judaism, that is converting mostly people who are not originally Jews to its own faith, and that no longer sees the need for those people in particular to follow many aspects of Jewish law. Right, so it's a text that really dramatizes that question of how these two faiths are going to relate to each other, whether indeed they will be two faiths, right? I mean, to say that it dramatizes a relationship between two faiths implies that from the beginning people knew that's the way the story was going to end, and I don't think the beginning of Acts makes you think that's the case. So there are a lot of debates within the text about the nature of the relationship between these two faiths, or these two emergent faiths. And there's really an attempt to present Christianity as well to two different kinds of audiences. Right, to a Jewish audience, which is appealed to frequently through citations of the Hebrew Bible. Right? There are a lot of those, in Greek translation, of course. And then also an attempt to speak to non-Jewish audiences, to Greco-Roman audiences who have a very different cultural agenda and need to be spoken to in very different ways. And this comes up in a lot of different ways throughout the text, right? One of the first moments of conversion we get is this Ethiopian eunuch who's converted, which is a very interesting little story in its own right. And it seems very pointed that very early in Acts, we see this person who could not be more outside the Israelite tradition being represented as a convert to being a follower of Jesus. There's a moment where Saul and his fellow proselytizer are in the small town of Lystra in Asia Minor, and they're mistaken as Hermes and Zeus while they're there. So there's a moment of sort of syncretism with pagan religion, which is very interesting. There are lots of debates about whether non-Jewish Christians, or for that matter, Jewish Christians, need to be circumcised if they're male or need to follow Jewish dietary law. There's a lot of debate about all these questions, right? And sometimes surprising debate that doesn't quite seem to sort itself out. It seems like at one point in Acts, we've resolved the circumcision question, and then Paul goes ahead and circumcises a Jewish follower of Jesus and says that needs to be done. So it's not always clear exactly where the lines are being drawn. I just put up a map of Paul's journeys of the kind you probably find in a Sunday school Bible or something, but just to point out the kind of range of space through which Paul was moving, which again covers much of the Greek world, ultimately, of course, Rome, but particularly the modern nation of Greece and the regions of modern Turkey that are also Greek-speaking in this period, although culturally more complex than that would imply. So just to kind of remind us that he's primarily speaking for most of the text to non-Jewish audiences, but he's not exclusively Jewish. There's a kind of structural pattern in many of Paul's visits, right, where he begins, he arrives in a new city, he speaks to the local Jewish community. He gives some kind of sermon, he receives rapturous applause the first week, and he comes back the next week, and suddenly there are all these non-Jews as well as Jews who've come to listen to him the second time, but suddenly local Jewish leaders are no longer happy with him and try to drive him out of town. Again, within that kind of narrative, we see another dramatization of the kind of relationship between Judaism and Christianity that Paul wants to see. So he comes to the story of his own conversion, if you want to call it that. And I've given the Greek there, but don't worry, I'm not going to rely on that. We can look at the English translation, the New Revised Standard Version here. So meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." And he's speechless and struck blind, and goes into the city of Damascus, and is eventually healed of his blindness, and there begins his career of converting people to being followers of Jesus. All right, so that's the first time we hear the story of conversion. Right, is this moment in Acts, but it's one of three times the story is told. So it's first told here by the narrator of Acts. It's then retold in the narrative twice by Paul himself to two different audiences. Once it's told to a crowd in Jerusalem as he's speaking to the crowd, again proselytizing, and then the final time it's told at his trial before Agrippa and Bernice, the king and his sister, who's also kind of half queen at the time, and they were educated in Rome as hostages. They're very definitely part of the Greco-Roman culture as well as the Jewish one. And there's a famous addition to the text at this point, right, that appears in the telling of the story of conversion to Agrippa and Bernice. which is the bit I put in red there. So when we'd all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the pricks." And it's a famous moment for a lot of people, the goads. Famous moment for a lot of people here. I'll get to the kicking against the goads in a minute, but first, that moment in the Hebrew language, which is itself interesting. You just popped up there. I hope that's not a problem. But so elsewhere in Acts, when people talk about the Hebrew language, it seems they mean Aramaic. Right? And indeed, this idea that languages have precise names that we use consistently all the time is very much a modern phenomenon, right? And if you look at the history of vernaculars everywhere, there's a tendency to kind of use names quite loosely. Right, in the Middle Ages, everything gets called Latin, including birdsong. Right, so it's not so strange, perhaps, that Aramaic would get referred to as Hebrew. But it's also interesting that we see it called a dialectos, or a dialect, as you might say. And my argument would be, if you look at the uses of dialectos and the sort of rival word glossa in the New Testament, there's a bit of a tendency for dialectos to be used in context where what we're talking about is sort of the language proper to a specific group of people. So we often get phrases like in their own dialect. So-and-so spoke to them in their own dialectos. And when we're referring to a language kind of seen as a coherent entity in the abstract, a specific language, but not as a language of a particular people, it's more often referred to as a glossa. Seems to be a bit of a tendency. So there's a sense in which by saying in the Hebrew dialect, it's saying in the language that these people would best appreciate, in their own language or something. And that's a strange comment to be making here. It's strange to underline the Aramaicness of this speech in this moment because of the actual content, which, as many people have pointed out, bears a strange resemblance to a line in Euripides' Bacchae, right? Where we have Dionysus has appeared in disguise, and he's speaking with Pentheus and trying to convince Pentheus to stop persecuting this new religion of Dionysus that has infected the city of Thebes. And in the exchanges that he has with Pentheus, he says, do not lecture me, but in escaping from prison, keep this in mind, or do you wish to punish me again? Dionysus says, I would sacrifice to him rather than, as a mortal to God, ragefully to kick against the pricks, or to kick against the goads. Right, so this seems like it may be a quotation from Euripides suddenly appearing in the mouth of Jesus in this moment of conversion that Paul experiences on the road. And then strangely that this moment quoted from Euripides is being quoted in Aramaic, right? Not in Greek, but in Aramaic. The rest of the text is in Greek, right? And we're left to imagine that Paul himself is speaking in Greek to this audience, or it wouldn't be necessary to say that this bit is in Aramaic, right? And yet, it seems as though Jesus is speaking in an Aramaic translation of Euripides, which is a very odd moment. Now, a lot of people solve the oddness of this moment, or resolve it, by deciding, well, there's no actual connection between the phrase in Acts and the phrase in Euripides. Well, it's just kind of a coincidence. A lot of people have argued, well, this is just a colloquial expression that would have been in everyday use in the Greek world. The problem with that is we never actually see it used anywhere else in the Greek world, and until afterwards. And we certainly see lots of Christian writers using the phrase themselves after Paul, but never any text that predates Paul using the phrase except for the Bacchae. So that's a little bit problematic in terms of saying it's just a coincidence here. Also perhaps problematic that there are so many structural parallels between the plot of Acts and the plot of the Bacchae. If you like, these stories that both dramatize the arrival of a new religion in town, this proselytizer who claims to be humble but maybe has this direct connection to the deity. In the case of the Bacchae, is in fact the deity, who escapes from prison miraculously, as Paul does on several occasions in Acts, and a number of parallels certainly that lots of people have suggested, that make that idea that this is a sort of simple coincidence or colloquial expression seem a little bit odd. But also the fact that when Paul is speaking to an Athenian audience, we're told he quotes the poet Aratus. And here's another one of these moments. The quotation is, well, the line is, as some even with the poets among you have said, for we are of his race, of the race of Zeus, that is. That line sounds much more generic than, it will be hard for you to kick against the goads. It sounds But those words on their own, we would never think were necessarily a quotation from anyone. You wouldn't leap to the conclusion they were a quotation from anyone. But as, even one of the poets among you has said, right, from the very text itself, we're being reminded this is a poetic quotation. So, we certainly see Paul himself quoting Greek poetry when it makes sense to do so, when he's speaking to an Athenian audience and wants to establish for that audience that he has a kind of intellectual formation that will make his new set of beliefs of interest to them. He quotes from a poet who incidentally was from his hometown of Tarsus, or roughly from his hometown of Tarsus, which may be part of why he knows it's rather difficult to read poem if any of you looked at it. But yeah, it does suggest that there's certainly room for literary quotation from the Greek and Latin, the Greek classics in particular in the New Testament. So, so another point here to think about. So the Eratus was that point. Sorry, it's difficult to see here because I have two slides kind of queued up at once. Second point I wanted to make here is that it seems from the best early manuscripts of Acts that Paul only makes this quotation from Euripides, or this possible quotation from Euripides, when he's speaking before the audience of Agrippa and Bernice, who have been educated in Rome, remember, and have this kind of cultural background such that the quotation might be memorable or interesting to them. When he's speaking to the crowd in Jerusalem, he does not use this quotation. And when the narrator describes Saul's conversion on the road to Damascus, he doesn't use this quotation, except in later manuscripts, where it's quite possible that obviously the line might have wandered back in from its citations elsewhere. Right? So all of this kind of makes one think that there might be something going on here. And I think it's very strange to imagine that Jesus would be speaking citing an Aramaic translation of Euripides. Very odd idea. And it's worth remembering that we don't have an Aramaic text here, right? We have a Greek text. That's why we have the line in the Hebrew language, right? The Hebrew dialect is, our text is speaking in Greek and therefore marks speech in another language by indicating the language being spoken, right? And so, my argument here would be that, and this is sort of building on what I have to say later in the talk about the Mouzi, that here he's using a quotation from Euripides in the context of an audience educated in Greek and Latin in order to relate these two cosmopolitan worlds of Hebrew/Christian religion and Greek culture, but also kind of points to the use of Aramaic here as a way of underscoring Jesus' own centrality to the Jewish world in a way that speaks very specifically to Agrippa and Bernice, who are Roman educated but Jewish, right? In some kind of way of indicating that this is a religion, perhaps, or a set of beliefs that is to speak to two different audiences. And, that's kind of on a micro scale what the story of Acts is on a larger scale, I think, that question of how to speak to these two audiences. I'll just dwell briefly on the idea of the nations here. Right? One of the sort of interesting and strange cases of translation between the Hebrews of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek of the New Testament, goyim, translated as nations usually, right, which has this kind of range of significance in Hebrew Bible context where it can mean nation just in a kind of neutral sense. It can mean nation including the Israelite nation, and also nation very pointedly not including the Israelite nation. That latter use is obviously the use that comes to be more prevalent over time. It gets translated as ta ethne, the ethne in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. That term ethne itself in Greek is sometimes used specifically to refer to non-Greeks, but often, it's a term that could just mean any group, including the Greeks. And in the New Testament, it's sometimes used as a gloss translation for goyim, very much in that context of non-Judeans, and sometimes in the sense of meaning all nations. And it seems like Paul, throughout his writing, kind of plays with that deliberately and exploits that ambiguity in different places. One in Romans, and again it says, "Rejoice nations with his people," which is a quotation from Deuteronomy. But when you see the quotation in Deuteronomy in its original context, it feels much more like the nations that are being spoken of there are nations that are in opposition to the nation of Israel, and that they're about to be punished, and that the reason that it's not the nations that are to rejoice, but Israel that is to rejoice at the defeat of its enemies. And yet Paul has taken that line, kind of cropped it selectively in his Greek translation of it, inserting it in his own text where it feels like the nations are the nations of the world, and they are indeed celebrating, not that they're being punished. Right, so just as a very quick illustration of a way in which Paul, when he cites the Jewish tradition, is also very capable of playing around with his source text. It seems to me likely that he would be doing the same in the case of the Greek tradition as well. And here, as sort of my moment of transition to the Chinese side, I just draw on this famous aphorism of Nietzsche's, right, about it's a subtle point that God learned Greek when he wanted to become a writer, and that he did not learn it better. And that's kind of a dig that Nietzsche is making against the fact that koinê Greek is kind of simpler grammatically and uses a less extensive vocabulary than certain classical texts and so on, right? And it's kind of, it's sort of an anti-Christian point on Nietzsche's point as well, obviously. And what I'd like to suggest is that actually, if Paul's any indication, in some ways, God learned Greek very well. And that, in fact, Paul is doing very complicated things with his Greek and with the ways in which he cites texts both from the Greek tradition and from the Jewish tradition in Greek in order to make his point. So, in a certain sense, I think Paul, at least, and therefore probably God knows Greek quite well. Certainly that's true of Mouzi. So when we look at the introduction, the preface to this treatise, we see it says, Mouzi had extensively studied the classics and their commentaries as well as the philosophers. There was no book, great or small, that he did not cherish. What's interesting, we get that very universal statement, which is not unusual, kind of biographical account of intellectual, but then goes on to say, well, actually, there are kind of books he didn't cherish. So it says, although he did not delight in the art of war, still he read it. Although he read books about the immortality of celestial beings, he did not believe such books, considering them to be highly boasting. But kind of, we begin with this claim of his great erudition. He's read everything, and then we move to, oh, well, he did read everything, but he didn't value all of it. And at the end of the preface, and I'm kind of looking only at little bits here, we have this interesting discussion too. So this is where Mouzi is turning his attention to Buddhism and really thinking about Buddhism, we're told. At this time, he sharpened his attention to the Buddha way, to the Tao of Buddhism. He scrutinized the 5,000 characters of the Laozi, imbibing its dark subtleties like wine, and toyed with the 5 classics, the Confucian classics, like a lute or woodwind. And he goes on, text goes on from there to explain that he has to try to figure out how to explain Buddhism to a Chinese audience, and there are many who reproach him from turning his back on the Confucian classics, turning towards esoteric ways. He wished to quarrel with them, but this was not the way. He wished to be silent, but this was not possible. Accordingly, he uses time with ink and brush to select and cite the words of the sages and wise men to prove and elucidate it. So what the preface announces, right, is that he's going to take the classics of what we would call Confucianism and Taoism and play with them in some kind of way. Appreciate their subtleties the way you would appreciate the subtleties of wine, play with them as you would a musical instrument, create out of them an argument for Buddhism. And what's really striking here is that he does create his argument for Buddhism entirely out of quotations from non-Buddhist texts from the Chinese tradition. Texts that were written by people who were ignorant of the existence of Buddhism. Right? So I won't draw on excessive detail on that, but wanted to give some examples here. I think this is from a particular section of the treatise where he deals specifically with this problem, where he's accused of kind of using these texts. So someone asked, you use the classics and commentaries to explain Buddha's words. Your words are abundant and your meaning lucid, your prose vigorous and your speech beautiful. If you didn't know this before, and if you hadn't noticed before, classical Chinese loves parallelism. You get obviously lots of that here. But it gets nowhere. This isn't the Buddhist truth. It's your debating points. Mouzi said, it's not my debating points, it's just that I see broadly and I'm not confused. He was asked, what's your technique for seeing broadly? Mouzi said, it comes from the Buddhist canons. Obviously it doesn't. At the time, when I did not yet understand the Buddhist canons, my confusion was deeper than yours. Though I recited the 5 classics, I treated them as flowers and did not attain their fruits. Right? So There's this idea that Confucian classics are flowers that bear fruit, and the fruit is Buddhism, Buddhist teachings. Once I observed the Buddhist canons and perused the essentials of Lao Tzu, I could preserve a tranquil nature, and gaze at the conduct of non-action. When I turned to inspect worldly affairs, it was as if I looked down on the heavenly well pass and stole a glance at mountainous ravines. I ascended Mount Song and Dai and saw hillocks and anthills. The 5 classics are the 5 flavors. The way of the Buddha is the 5 grains. So there again, the idea Chinese love these correlative systems of the 5 this and the 5 that. The 5 flavors, obviously, there's a lack of substance that is then provided in the 5 grains. The 5 grains provide the nourishment that Buddhism can provide. After I heard the way, it was as if the clouds parted and I saw the blazing sun, as if torches entered a gloomy room. And just to kind of gloss briefly a few of the moments in this text that are drawing on earlier Chinese texts, where he says, I see broadly and I'm not confused. It's a famous line from the Analects, where Confucius says, at 30 I was established, at 40 I was not confused, and at 50 I knew the way of heaven. It goes on from there to 60 and 70 and so on. But I put this on Facebook actually when I hit 40 a couple of years ago, but I was not confused. And it's sort of a satisfying thought that you do achieve this at the age of 40. I don't know if that's really true or not. But at any rate, it's a very, very legible quotation even to this day in Chinese. It's a very, very famous line. And here again, this tranquil nature and non-action, we can see that the phrasing there is taken more or less from the Zhuangzi, another one of the major Taoist texts, we can say. And then finally, I particularly like this line about ascending Mount Song and Dai and then seeing hillocks and anthills. Because these mountains, like Mount Tai, are seen within the Chinese tradition. So they're sacred mountains, right? They're paragons of everything that is great. And this comparison of these great mountains to the tiny anthills or whatever is this great kind of perspectivalism of, yes, we want to be looking down from the heights, up from the little rise of the anthill and so on. But in a way, what he's doing is taking the sacred geography of China, including these mountains, and he's turning them into the anthills. And sort of saying, well, what I now know through Buddhism makes your mountains look like anthills, look like the anthills you're supposed to see from those mountains. And I think that's sort of what's at stake in this particular passage. And so it's how you explain and glorify and defend a religion by using the texts of another religion, right? And so I think, again, it's a way of mediating between cosmopolitan systems. Buddhism does present to a kind of interesting challenge for the Chinese world, right? Because it is, something that makes genuinely universal claims of its own that are not entirely compatible with a culture that's already very confident in its own strengths at this point. And so the engagement between the two is a very problematic and very delicate one, potentially. A lot of other proselytizers do take a more vernacular approach, right? An approach more of speaking to everyday needs. I think there's something very interesting about this approach of speaking very exclusively to an elite audience, using elite quotations of elite interest from an existing tradition, playing with them in some kind of way, taking them out of context, and yet using them to build an argument for this new external religion by suggesting that in some way it's really the fulfillment of what was already there in China. And so it's not the same process as what I see happening in Athens, right? Because the power relationships among Judaism, Christianity, Greek culture, the Roman Empire are a different constellation than the constellation we see in the Han Dynasty as it's falling apart, but importing this religion from outside. They're not the same dynamics, and so the solutions look a little different in detail, but something structurally similar is going on, which is the relationship between one cosmopolitan tradition and another, and how you try to defend or explain the new one in terms of language and the old. So thank you very much for your time, and I welcome questions.
That you will then cite people will refer back to from memory. If we take that down, we can see who else is in the room. That's okay with you. Quite big. Right. Okay. So, meanwhile, those of you here present, begin to take Alex up on his intentions. Harry.
Just kind of push you a little bit. Because I think it adverts to a kind of argument so I think I don't think we're agreed that the book of Acts is kind of a novelistic, as it were, kind of a novelistic account of all that relationship with Acts as it was already. And so I think I really do wonder whether the language that we're not really dealing so much in the book of Acts with starting with Judaism and ending with Christianity, so much as we're dealing with the starting with one version and moving into cosmopolitanism, understanding of Judaism. So we're not really dealing with the virgin from one version to another transformation of Judaism as a part of the order and not coming up in short version. Here I wonder whether it would help to contextualize the book of Acts, which I date later in the second century, second quarter of the second century, and kind of read it within the context of Pan-Hellenism, which is to say, kind of, here I think that's saying right, who's promoting a Hellenic vision, helps them to perhaps understand how the book of Acts is appropriating discourse of the Roman Empire, but now using Paul. The book of Acts has Paul going around Paul promoting the unity of churches exactly in a certain Asian-like world where it really is doing the same thing. This one final observation. That has to do with the whole idea of we are this children from the inheritance. That Zeus, we are his children, so that his subject is Zeus. It's very interesting from the perspective of Hellenism that he was promoting himself as sort of Indian Zeus, and as a sort of vice regent of Zeus, who's developing all the people in one. In which case, then, that the book of Acts would be drawing on man to represent Paul, not so much as a convert of Judaism, so much as, the Lutheran, as it were, Lutheran church is another combination.
Can I ask you just to hold your answer for a moment so I can get a sense of whether or not people in other places are hearing the question? Failing that, I might ask you just to reprise the bit of the question you choose to answer. Can we unmute you in Montreal? Can you hear me?
All right,
there?
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, Stephen. Were you able to hear that question in the room here or not?
No, it's quite choppy. The presentation was perfect. It was crystal clear.
Right.
But since the question period began, I didn't get any of that.
Well,
I don't
the
know.
question
How
was
was it for you, Yelda?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's very choppy.
The questions are coming from some distance. I think, so far as you can, Alex, if you come back
Sure.
To the microphone here and give a sense of where Harry is taking.
Sure. So yeah, just kind of to recapitulate at least part of the question, and please jump in if I'm butchering the question, the process. But you're suggesting that the context in which to think about what's going on in Acts may be kind of Hadrianic era Pan-Hellenism, and that the text may be trying to appropriate some version of that as a way of understanding what's going on in it, rather than representing what's happening as a conversion from Judaism per se. Okay, good. It's always easy to summarize something else, right? And I like what you're saying, right? I mean, this isn't my text, obviously it's yours. I'm very happy to think of it in that way. And if we think about the Chinese text I brought in, I mean, as I say, it dates itself, the historical context it mentions, to the 180s or so, 190s. There's no reason to believe that it really is from that time. People argue about this a lot, and as I say, people come up with serious dates 200 or 300 years later. So, and obviously, the question of exactly how the text then integrates into its own particular political context is one we can't answer without knowing when it was written. Right? And I like your sort of insertion into that Hadrianic cultural context, right? If someone comes along and says, no, that's the wrong date for Acts, then it goes off too, right? But so, coming at this from sort of literary perspective, I guess, I have a bit of a tendency to give up on precise dating for these kinds of texts and kind of draw on, an idea, well, let's see what's going on internally within the text if we're not in a good position to be certain about the grounding. Within the text, I mean, I take your point that I'm speaking very loosely to kind of talk about conversion from Judaism to Christianity. But I mean, things that are happening within Acts, right, at least as we move along, as we are encountering, the hostility of certain kinds of Jews to Paul's teachings, or by implication to Jesus' teachings. We're being reminded of that frequently, and we're also being reminded of the idea that new believers or new followers are coming from outside Judaism, as an ethne anyway. All right, so that, and it's sloppy of me to kind of describe the things that are going on there as Judaism and Christianity. I mean, obviously both of these things are, what they're going to become is still totally in flux, right? But, right, as it is for me to talk about Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism in the same period in China, incidentally, right? So I completely agree with you that the context you suggest is one that makes perfect sense. We're sort of expanding to the political dimension of what's being said, and sort of expanding beyond the confines of the text itself. I'd be excited to pursue that kind of reading.
I think that Paul here in Acts is being represented as a very cosmopolitan kind of guy, as opposed to this sort of ethnocentric form of Judaism that rejects circumcision for the offspring.
Yeah.
Right? And that encourages a kind of hand-blended vision, so that you really kind of play out how high-value and legalistic his opponents are, how violent they are, to make persuasive and /friendly sort of Paul, which then creates a whole identity version then from Christianity to Judaism. As I said, it's not really a conversion, it's more like a transformation of what you mean by bias.
Yeah.
So I would rather use the word transformation than conversion. I mean, I know that Paul is struggling for something.
At least in Caravaggio.
And I know that enigmatic Western wanderers, right, who have Augustine wandered, and that I find it entirely clear that Paul is going through what we name.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think there's every reason to be skeptical. There's a question about, the extent to which Paul is going through what we would call a religious conversion, and the extent to which instead, it's a transformation of some kind towards, and I think, there's nowhere in the text where it says he's converting, right, in any kind of explicit way, right? First of all, I think that's the most basic level on which we would say that is, he's off to Damascus to persecute people who follow Jesus, and then he changes his mind and he stops persecuting them. And it's not immediately clear in that moment in the text that he's doing anything other than ceasing to persecute, right? And he's not being asked to do anything, even. When Jesus comes down, he sort of says, why are you persecuting me? I'm Jesus, I'm the one you're persecuting. So, I mean, it becomes, as you say, a paradigmatic moment of conversion, and in terms of reader response or whatever, at some point, that reading becomes extremely important, right? But it is not something that's required by the text in any way. And then this is something I think with the early Chinese text I talked about as well. It's just true that we always have to deal with the reception history of 2,000 years that has imposed such strong readings on the text that it's very difficult sometimes to step away from those readings and try to think about the text in other ways, including just our own ways, let alone in terms of trying to get to an authentic original reading.
May I ask a question from Montreal?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Sorry if I'm butting in and stepping on toes. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, Alex. I had some reservations about, engaging in a talk at 8 p.m. in the evening here in Montreal, but it really was a treat. So thank you very, very much. Let me know if you miss any of this question, by the way. It's hard to judge how well I'm being heard. But I was Great. I was particularly interested in what you had to say about the self-reflexivity of literary cosmopolitanism. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. How does that relate to the development of literature? Is it the case, do you think, that self-reflexivity is something that literature does really well, and this helps to condition or push along the process of self-reflexivity about, the ecology's growing sense of universality? Or is it possibly the other way around? Or I'll leave it there.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, first of all, I think we're all, at least personally as a reader, I'm always inclined to look for the moments of self-reflexivity in text. I think it's kind of intellectual training, perhaps, as much as anything. And in developing this kind of theory, thinking about literary ecologies and thinking about ways in which literatures interact with their cultural environments and so on, it's obviously very appealing to start to think about particular moments in text that seem aware of doing what I see them as doing. Right? But I think the cosmopolitan environment I speak about in particular is one that's particularly interesting for this, in that there are certain historical moments, right, where cultural communities become aware that they just become much bigger in one way or another. Right? And I think that can have an impact on the way people write and the way people talk about it. And one of the things I say in the book, in sort of a little bit more detail, that there's sort of tropes that you find with a lot of these ecological formations. And one of them for the cosmopolitan environment is that writers take these moments from earlier texts and try to find some way to universalize, try to find some way to take a particular image or something from an earlier tradition and make it no longer just about a local place, but about the world at large, kind of make the geography of the local place become the geography of the universe in some way. So I think there is, not an awareness, I think there's some kind of awareness often in these texts that they are speaking to a different audience, right? I mean, that's maybe the way I would put it. That they're aware that the particular kind of audience that they have has grown or has shifted in some kind of way, includes maybe different kinds of people. And texts do often try to take that into account in their own self-presentation, as well as in the content. Sure. Right.
Fascinating. I'm still thinking about the problem of the two kinds of cosmopolitan communities. Partly because, for example, the social self-consciousness seeing in the sense that happened. Well, but politics is fundamentally different. Each language that is at that point. There is no history of the idea of translation existed as kind of necessary. Literary translation from Bible is something.
That's very good, isn't it?
So is that kind of
I think it would be, and I think it would also be. This is a question about sort of the uniqueness or otherwise of the Chinese case in this period of Mouzi and so on, where there isn't a history of translation prior to that in the Chinese world. And I think, other than for functional purposes, but it's interesting to think about the role of translation in ancient cultures generally, first of all. And we do get more instances of translation between Greek and Latin, but not very many, actually, relative to sort of the overall quantities of texts that we know about. And there are often moments of translation that are very playful, if you like. Translation, not translations intended to give a literal understanding of the text to an audience that doesn't know the first language, but rather Catullus translating Sappho, for example, and kind of showing off his own skills as a poet in the process, right? Which is not the same thing as what we think of by literary translation, or what is meant by translation in the context of Buddhist texts in China, where trying to get at the original text is presumably important, right? But so there's that. But I think it's also something that is a little bit unusual about the Chinese cosmopolitan context is that until Buddhism, at least, or with the exception of Buddhism, the comparative lack of other rival cosmopolises. It's my argument about Latin, for example, that Latin really becomes a cosmopolitan language more after the fall of Rome rather than before. But it's striking that during the entire length of time of the Roman Empire, that Greek remains the language of government and business in the Eastern Empire, and no one really bothers to translate Latin literature into Greek until the Middle Ages. It doesn't seem to have been interesting to any Greek to imagine what it would be like to translate Virgil into Greek, right? It's just somehow unthinkable. And, so Latin, as it sort of emerges as a cosmopolitan language, is doing so with Greek in the background, right? And it's also doing so also with Christianity in the background as a different kind of cosmopolis, which it wants to link itself to, but can't uniquely link itself to. And and similarly, Arabic and Persian are in a kind of dynamic relationship, and this really gets repeated all over the place. Sanskrit and Persian are also kind of rival cosmopolises that overlap with each other for significant periods of time. And, so I think it's possible to kind of think typologically about this kind of system and say there are half a dozen or 8 or something in world history that you can kind of identify, and then say that each of them, because there's so few of them, it's also worth thinking about how diverse they are as a group, as part of a typology, just because we can count them all. The other kinds of typologies I talk about, national literary ecologies, there's so many of those that it's a little bit harder to just kind of work through all the examples, and it makes more sense to speak in general terms. But cosmopolises are very different, I think, in their structures. Yeah.
To follow up on Bruce's, the one way to think of what's going on using Confucianism, Taoism, language, references. The guy was just this is referred to gods in the present. So it's not in any way self-conscious. So we look at it maybe from the outside. So, whereas for the perspective of someone writing just what truth is all resting in this term.
Yeah. Well, and of course, that depends partly on when we date the text too, as well. If we do date it to the 2nd century, then that makes a great deal of sense, and especially because there aren't really translations available, right? And there's nothing for him to cite. But if it's as late as the 5th century or something, then and then it is very strange, I think, to find an entire Buddhist treatise that never once quotes a Buddhist text, but constantly quotes Confucian and Taoist rites. And even if we kind of take this early dating, even if we say, well, yes, of course, particularly in classical Chinese, of course, we always explain everything through citations, it's still kind of striking that you get, in a way, a very weak sense of what Buddhism is by reading this text, right? You learn through negation sometimes. And so he complains about, where it's always this questionnaire that's then responded to by by the Mouzi figure. And the questioner will say things like, isn't it horribly wrong that Buddhist monks shave their heads? Like that's, no Chinese person should ever shave their head. There are some cultural reasons for not doing this, and isn't this horribly wrong? And then he comes up with textual quotations from Confucius and so on that show, oh, well, actually it's all just fine to shave your head. But you never get a sense of why anyone in Buddhism would be shaving their head. Right? You never get any sense of why people believe in reincarnation. Say, that fact is brought up, that factor is brought up, but not. So you can't learn anything about Buddhism from the text, which is kind of an interesting feature of it.
Can you just check in with Sarah and Yella in case any questions there? No? We'll carry on in real space here.
Towards the end, you mentioned the vernacular approaches, contrast to the cosmopolitan. Where do you see the overlap between those two? The cosmopolitan approach to perceive the vernacular. I'm thinking of like an example of our verse in Latin or classical. Can you just kind of spell out context of how that?
Well, I mean, I take sort of my thinking on this in part from Sheldon Pollock, right? This guy working in the Sanskrit context, and he talks about vernacularism as a response to cosmopolitan languages, as a sort of reaction that at some point people kind of decide. But and the interesting thing, right, in the South Asian context, he uses, but it's kind of true in other places as well. People write vernacular languages for certain kinds of purposes relatively early, but it doesn't occur to people to write literature in those languages until much later, to write sort of literary text, however we want to define that very problematic term, literary text, right? And so people will write deeds or sort of legal documents in a vernacular language very early on and get court transcripts and such things. But to write poetry and record it through writing, right, does seem to be something that happened, And so I actually talk about a kind of vernacular system that emerges out of cosmopolitan systems this way, where people make this very deliberate choice to write in a vernacular language, which they know will not reach as large an audience, potentially, as the cosmopolitan language. It may have sort of deeper roots in the community, may not. I mean, one of the challenges of creating vernacular languages is that in most parts of Eurasia, there are these kind of vast dialect continua that sweep across large parts of territory. And so picking the dialect of Florence, as Dante does, doesn't necessarily mean that someone in Naples or Venice is actually that much better off than if you were writing in Latin, maybe even worse off. Same's kind of true in China, right? That to invent a vernacular language in China means creating a language that's hard for a lot of people to learn. Maybe just as hard as the classical language was. So, that's one of the, and also the vernacular languages are not always as closely tied to polities as later kind of national languages are. So, while Dante is writing in his early version of Italian, not calling it Italian, mind you, but calling it vulgar Latin, but creating this literary language, or helping to create this literary language, other people are writing in French next door, writing at roughly the same time. Marco Polo's travels are being transcribed in what's mostly French. And it doesn't occur to people, well, but we're Italians, we should write in Italian. Like, that thought is a much later thought. But the thought is, we want to reach a slightly larger audience, and the kind of audience we can't reach through this cosmopolitan language. And certainly, obviously, religion has often been a vehicle for vernaculars in that way, with that very idea of we need to reach the people who can't be reached some other way. But to do so in writing is different than to do so in speech. And to try to reach a mass audience through a vernacular language in writing is not such an easy thing to do until an enormous infrastructure already exists in that language, by which time that population has probably already been reached in some other way. Yeah, so the question is sort of, is there any evidence to suggest, any data that might suggest that this kind of cosmopolitan textual strategy might be more successful than other kinds. And I think to some extent this is about, well, we don't have, the answer is no. I guess I don't have a body of data that I could point to like that. What you do have is sort of, the fact that the more people you can speak to, I suppose, the larger the rhetoric is, the more inclusive the rhetoric is in some kind of way. Well, the problem is often that what gets preserved in text is preserved by the people who won the intellectual debate, right? So we don't necessarily know as much as we might about what other sides in the debate might look like. In the Mediterranean case, right, so much depends on what medieval monks chose to transcribe at certain key moments in history, and they weren't always as invested in transcribing the people they didn't agree with. I mean, that's always one of the problems. So, it's difficult to know whether what survived was what worked, and what worked was what worked in a particular way, or whether what survived is what worked because it won the war, the literal physical war, right? Constantine conquering the sentence. No, I guess what I meant by saying that conversion is a cosmopolitan experience is that it's an experience that involves an interaction between distinct worldviews in some kind of way. If it doesn't, it's not. If what you're doing is not changing your worldview on some fairly large scale, then it's not going to be probably what we're calling conversion. So by definition, in that sense, even if what you're doing is moving from a larger set of ideas to a smaller set of ideas. And I think there are larger numbers of people who move in the other direction historically, right? But I think nonetheless, it's still a moment where someone is forced to contemplate two different systems of thought in some kind of way and to negotiate that relationship. And what I've been following is kind of the textual dimension of that. Partly because if you're looking at the ancient world, that's all you can look at. But
I wonder if a good example that you're talking about in terms of the use of a kind of cosmopolitanism might be the apologetic literature of the 2nd century, 3rd century. Say, I think especially about Prophet Alexandria, right? Alexandria, first quarter of the 3rd century, who's drawing regularly on a vast repertoire of classical texts, pre-Socratic texts, Platonic texts, and so on, and adopts this language with a view to really converting into what he thinks is a much more sustainable cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, he would be an excellent example. I mean, he's someone I mostly think of as a classicist, of course, because he happens often to be the only person who gives us a lot of those particular texts, right? And so we treasure him for that. But no, that's exactly the sort of phenomenon I'm speaking of. I was sort of interested in using Paul, perhaps, or the Acts as the place to do that, just to sort of suggest that it's also happening in earlier contexts as well. But certainly. And certainly at that point, we're talking about a very specific kind of audience for conversion as well. An audience most likely to be persuaded through textual citation and so on.
I mean, but maybe to take it out of Christianity and put it more in a practical context, let's say somebody like Plutarch, on this one-month Greek mythology, translating Greek mythology, like scheme.
Sure, right. I mean, I think that's a moment, right? A moment of Roman imperial power being more or less at its height and all that kind of thing. It's a moment where thinking in universal terms and thinking in terms that will speak to large audiences is particularly meaningful to people, right? I mean, a century or two later, it ceases to be as meaningful a way of communicating.
Okay, shall we just check any more questions or comments out there? No? Okay. Well, thank you for your company, Yelda. and Sarah. We'll do this again soon. In fact, why don't I just announce, while you're still online, that the next and final talk in this series here will be on March 2nd, which is a Monday, 5 o'clock Pacific time. And it will be Celia Schultz from the Department of Classical Studies at the University of Michigan. And her topic is emic and etic notions of sacrifice among the Romans. So really, I guess we should have you back that day. We'll Skype you in, or we'll send you the meeting code. It'll be dinner time for you too, won't it? Those of us who are here, we're going for dinner now, at least if that's the arrangement that you have made. In any case, Alex is staying until, this all as of tomorrow morning anyway, so we can carry on conversations about conversion, religion, morality. How wonderful, from the point of view of the early modern conversions team, whose subtitle is Religions, Cultures, Ecologies, to have a man who is framing arguments about literature and conversion in ecological terms. And that's some of the language that you guys are using on the other side of this great divide, which is now joining the groups together. So Alex, for galvanizing us in this way, and also for enabling us to launch the Green Genes part of this project, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks to